Welcome everyone to the Antinatalist Advocacy podcast, where we speak to interesting and knowledgeable people about how best to protect sentient beings from the harms of coming into existence. I'm your host, John, an antinatalist advocate from the UK, and I'll be the main host of the podcast going forward. We've talked a lot at Antinatalist Advocacy about not wanting to create an echo chamber. We think that a podcast where everybody agreed with our particular flavour of antinatalism and also fully supported our approach to activism would be, quite frankly, a bit dull. That's why last month we hosted our criticisms panel with Lenny and Conundrum, where they gave constructive feedback on all things antinatalist advocacy. Please do check out that episode 10, if you haven't already. Links, as always, are in the description. This month, we wanted to take the criticism a bit broader than that by inviting a critic of the two ideologies that guide a lot of our thinking at AA, namely antinatalism and effective altruism. That's why we're delighted to bring you this conversation with Professor of Philosophy at Scripps College, Rivka Weinberg. I think that Rivka is one of the most important voices in the discussion around procreative ethics. Rather than dismissing antinatalism out of hand, as happens so often in this space, Rivka has engaged critically with leading antinatalist thinkers and carefully laid out why she believes that procreation can be permissible in some limited circumstances. I think that it is important to platform this kind of constructive criticism, even if I don't ultimately agree with her conclusions on antinatalism, to prevent us from becoming the echo chamber I mentioned earlier. As for her views on effective altruism, well, I'll let her air her concerns for herself in this episode. Let's just say I don't expect to see her at an effective altruist convention anytime soon. Anyway, without further ado, I bring you episode 11 of the Antinatalist Advocacy podcast with Rivka Weinberg. Enjoy. Welcome, everyone, to episode 11 of the Antinatalist Advocacy podcast. And welcome to our guest, Professor Rivka Weinberg. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Great. Am I okay to call you Rivka?
Please.
Great. Very standard kind of opening question for a podcast. Tell us a bit about who you are, where you're from, current role, that kind of thing.
I'm a philosopher. I teach at Scripps College in Claremont, California. I grew up ultra-Orthodox in Brooklyn, New York. I went to college at night. I worked through it. And then I went to University of Michigan for graduate school. I spend most of my time worrying about existing and meaninglessness. And I wrote my first book on forcing people to exist. And my next book, which should come out maybe next year, is about death, time, and meaning. So that's about me.
And you mentioned, obviously, you're worrying about pointlessness and the meaning of existence. How did you first get into philosophy and those kind of like philosophical musings?
I think I was always interested in philosophy, but I didn't know that there was a term for these kinds of questions and a discipline. And so I kind of stumbled into it. When I started, Brooklyn College had a really extensive core program of requirements. And I started off as an English major, which I kept, but I added philosophy after my first semester because philosophy was a required class and it was open. And I took it like, oh, I didn't know this was a thing. This is my thing. So it was pretty quick.
Great. And just as an aside, you mentioned growing up Orthodox. Did religion...
The ultra part.
Pardon?
Ultra. Don't forget the ultra part.
Sorry, yes. Ultra-Orthodox.
Okay. The beard, the costumes, all of it.
Did that have any... kind of influence on your early interest in philosophy, the big questions, that kind of thing?
I think probably because you're always thinking kind of big questions about the point of life, whether there's a God. Even being forced into existence kind of came to me in a certain way of like, well, this is not a very good deal. I wouldn't have accepted this deal. And then that, kind of led me both to become more of an atheist and also to worry about creating people. Because you're forcing them to exist, which is, not a good deal.
Yeah, I think I can relate to some extent. I did. I was raised as a pretty nominal Christian, but I was the only one of my siblings who kind of took Christianity seriously. And then when I became somewhat of an unfortunate angry keyboard atheist, it did start me to think about, like, what's the point of being here, and right and wrong, and the meaning of life. Obviously, you just touched it there, but how did you first become interested in procreative ethics specifically?
I think, I would like to say I was born and I didn't like it. And I think that's pretty much the truth. I have a lot of siblings also. So my parents had a lot of kids. And I was like, why do you have so many? And they would say, well, which one shouldn't we have had? And I was like, that's easy. Skip me. I always felt, because, put upon, like, life is difficult and scary and very risky. And I would not have agreed to it. So I think that was very early for me, that kind of thought.
And there's a bit of a stigma, interestingly, within the antinatalist community. Like, we're often told that we're just kind of depressed, and if we had a different kind of disposition, then maybe we wouldn't be antinatalists. But I know that you said elsewhere something that I do agree with. That is, like, I don't have disposition, but like a lot of people's views of procreative ethics do appear to be broadly based in, kind of how they view life. I don't know if disposition is the right kind of phrase. But yeah, like, to what extent do you think that plays a role in procreative ethics in general, and your own views as they relate to procreative ethics?
I think temperament influences how you interpret experience. And so you might think that life is, because whether life is good or bad, there are, we can talk about this, there are, objective list theories of well-being, but even those have a subjective element to them. Is your life, does it have meaning for you? Is it joyous? Are your social relationships satisfying? You can't take the subjective element out of an assessment of your own well-being. There's an objective element also, but I think that subjective element can come into play and color the way you think, your overall outlook about life. Is it good or bad? Is it worth it or is it not worth it? Is it too anxiety provoking, too much risk, or too little risk? Because there is a variety of rational approaches to risk. So which one you take, I do think, is temperamentally influenced. And so that is the way, and I think temperament can influence the way you look at this question, but I think rational argument can help you settle the question, taking into account that temperament does play a part in interpretation of experience.
Yes. And I think that's a really, like, acknowledging that temperament does play an important role, I think is really important for antinatalists, because I do feel that there's almost too much of a backlash against it, saying, no, we're being purely rational, and the other side, they're all kind of the fanatical life lovers. They're influenced by their temperament, but we're not. And I think it's just not true. It just doesn't, like, it would be important for us to know, like, who these ideas kind of appeal to, how people come to become antinatalists, and acknowledging the role of temperament, even from that perspective, I think is super important.
Yeah, well, I think temperament plays a role, but for sure it does. I mean, I think it does. And I don't know why it would play a role only in one kind of interpretation, not in the other one. That's kind of David Benatar's argument. It's like, well, everybody's being a Pollyanna. And I'm like, well, maybe you're a Scrooge. I think I'm a Scrooge.
Yes.
And I think that you have to acknowledge that, and then think about, that doesn't mean you give up on the argument and just think it's just your temperament. And then think about what role this temperamental influence plays in deciding whether having children is moral or not. So I think that's where I go with it. And I think that Benatar, one of the flaws in his argument is in thinking that in his view that people have Pollyanna syndrome, and they look at the world through rose-colored glasses. And if they were just, cold and sober, they would know that life is bad. I don't see where he gets that authority to say that. I don't know why perspective is somehow less colored than somebody else's. And so I don't accept that. I also don't think being cold, hard, and sober is a good idea. I think, but he doesn't. But anyway, I think that, so that's the way in which temperament plays a role, but it doesn't mean that you cannot have a reasoned argument but you do have to acknowledge that part of a person's experience, there's a subjective element to it. It's not the only element. So if somebody says, I'm deliriously happy because somebody keeps them on a drug and takes all their money and rapes them or something, well, there's an objective part as well. But there's both.
And definitely, and that does tie into my next question, which is going to be your points of agreement and disagreement with antinatalism.
So I think there's sort of two strains of argument, two lines of argument. So one is, I'll take Shiffrin's first. So the consent. Nobody consents to be born. You don't ask to be born. You're forced into it. I think that means a lot. I think it's pretty, that's usually, we don't let people, it's a really consequential thing you're doing to somebody. You're forcing them into existence. And I've said this before, but it's like the flip side of murder, right? You just you're forcing a person into life instead of taking them out of life. And we usually think, you shouldn't run a person's life in that way. A person gets to make their own decisions. And the reason I don't think this argument succeeds, though, is because we make decisions on behalf of our children all the time because they cannot make decisions on their own. We decide what their language is, what their name is, where they're going to go to school, what they're going to eat, so many things about them, including things that have lifelong effects. Now, Shiffrin says, well, that's because there's a difference between a pure benefit and a regular benefit. We're entitled to, to exercise that paternalistic authority over children only when to not do so would deprive them of something or would, be dangerous or they need it. But that's not actually the case. We teach kids how to ride bicycles. When they're going to fall off, they're going to get hurt. Who cares? And it's not like this grand, joy in life to ride a bicycle. You can have you can live a perfectly fine, delighted life, never seeing a bicycle. So we also think that it's fine to do it because we think all things considered, we use our paternalistic authority to decide which risks are permissible or consistent with the child's interest to impose. And so that's why I think the argument does not work. It puts a lot of weight, though, on paternalistic authority. Yes. And sometimes you could sag a little under that weight, right? It still leaves me with these worries. They're like, it's not great. But I don't think the argument on its own is a success. Yes. Because the consent part of it doesn't hold. Children do not have consent rights. Paternalism is appropriate when you don't have consent rights. And the argument that, well, the person has to live with what you did their whole life applies to many things that we do to children. So that's the way in which I don't. So those are my points of agreement and disagreement with the consent-based line of argument. Now, the other line of argument is just that life is terrible. And I think it is. If it's terrible, you shouldn't do this to somebody else. But what I discovered in talking to people, there are a lot of people think life is really great. And I don't have an objective stance to say, well, it's terrible for you. It's a bad experience. It's bad for your well-being. You don't get what you desire. And I don't think that works. And Benatar also knows that people are happy. And he says, well, but they're deluded and they're seeing through rose-colored glasses. But why does he have the clear glasses? Where is the non-diluted prescription? How does he know his glasses are clear? Maybe they're foggy. Maybe he's the Scrooge and they're the Pollyanna. And so I don't think he has a standpoint outside of the delusion to say, I am the one seeing clearly. You're the ones not seeing clearly. And so that's the way in which I don't agree with Benatar. The ways in which I agree with antinatalist views is I think we don't acknowledge how bad life can be, even subjectively speaking, for so many people for a good portion of their lives. I also think we don't think enough about the risks of life and how risky it is and how, even a good life can turn out badly. People can have, terrible diseases or experiences. And I think that really should give us pause. I also think the kinds of risks you're imposing. Should you have a child when if you're a woman, should you get pregnant at 40 instead of at 30? I think all other things equal, that's completely impermissible given the risks to the child and how much they rise in that 10-year period when you're as you're going from 30 to 40 for whatever reason you want to do. So those are ways in which I agree with antinatalists. I'm still not comfortable. And if in my own work, if you add up all the risks and all the constraints, there's gonna be a lot fewer permissible children around. But I don't go all the way and say it's always impermissible, because I don't think we can say that life is bad, period. I think there's a subjective interpretation to that statement that we have to allow for. And it doesn't make sense to discount the vast majority of people who are happy to be alive, who like to be alive, and who, for some reason, I don't understand why, think that life is good. So that's sort of the points of agreement and disagreement. There is another argument that Benatar has about how it's more important, how it's more important. A good thing, being deprived of good doesn't matter if there's nobody subject to the deprivation, but being deprived of a bad thing is good even if there's nobody you're depriving from. He calls it a symmetry argument. I don't think that argument succeeds at all. I have no sympathy with it. It's a best explanations argument. It says, well, in order to best explain 4 other opinions we have to believe this asymmetry. I think there are other better explanations for the 4 opinions, and so I don't think that argument succeeds. The stronger arguments are the consent arguments and the quality of life arguments, which I think have a lot of weight and still leave me worried. And whenever my kids suffer, I feel like it's my fault. And I think it is, actually. Although, when they're happy, I don't think it's my fault. I've written about this elsewhere. That's a different asymmetry.
And I think that's just, if you focus on the consent argument first, I do think, I do agree with your contention with the consent argument, that in the particular way that it's framed around making this huge choice in somebody's life, which is lifelong. As you said, there are tons of things, my parents didn't make me a star basketball player when I was going. I'm useless at all sports. They could have done, but I would never be a brilliant athlete if my parents didn't really invest in that at a young age for me, and that kind of has lifelong. But it does definitely have lifelong consequences. And your objection to the consent argument doesn't say that therefore parents can consent to their child coming to existence. Is like, parents can consent to certain things for their children. And I think there's an argument to be had either way as to whether or not coming to existence is one of them. Would that be a correct kind of formulation of your objection?
Yes. So you would have to, so the lack of consent itself doesn't render the act impermissible. You would have to decide whether this is the kind of risk that it is permissible to impose in your on the basis of your paternalistic authority.
Yes, definitely, and that's where I think there's a lot of interesting arguments to be had. I mean, there are certain things that parents consent to around the world that some people would object to, whether that's genital mutilation or child marriage. I think there's lots of things there. And, antinatalists have a lot of weight to say 1 in 3 risk of cancer and all the harms of a life. And is this the kind of thing that people have the paternalistic authority to do? But you're right. I think when it's formed in that narrow way of, parents consenting on these lifelong decisions, then it leaves themselves open to quite an easy rebuttal.
Yeah. I mean, just to say something about the cancer thing, I don't know if it's 1 in 3 people get cancer, but you have to die of something.
Yes.
Most people I would like to look at premature deaths, other kinds of things, but I don't think that most people who are dying after a normal lifespan in their late 70s or their 80s think that because they're dying of cancer, it would be better if they never lived.
Yes.
I don't that rationality has to force you to that conclusion. I actually don't see that to be the case.
No, definitely. And I do think that the 1 in 3 statistic, by the way, is just for people who will develop cancer at some point in their life. So there's obviously a huge difference between someone who has a horror diagnosis at 35 compared to someone who's 90 and, as you said, they're going to die of something else at some point.
Yeah.
They're both included within that 1 in 3 statistic. But you're right, as you said before, there's tons of risks within there. And I think antinatalists have some compelling arguments within it. It's just not in that particular formulation. And within the objections to David Benatar's kind of assessment of life and whether or not he's people are being Pollyanna-ish. I do think, again, which touches on the temperament points, I do think that antinatalists, again, are maybe not acknowledging that their own, as you said, their own potentially slightly Scrooge-like tendencies. And as we said before, it's not that there's no rational argument that can't be had there. And I think that David Benatar's work, and then particularly in Better Than Ever to Have Been, I think he does a good job in terms of raising awareness of some of the downsides in life. But as you said, I think they're kind of two sides of the same coin, and it doesn't lead to a hard rule, like a hard objection either way.
Yeah, and if you look at Benatar's work, actually, which when he talks about a world of suffering, I find that chapter quite hilarious and fun, but he does not have a world of enjoyment. He has no corresponding list of the pleasures and joys that people have in life. And so it does not seem like a balanced assessment.
No, definitely. And I would definitely agree with that. That, yes, there is merit to be had in terms of pointing out some of the stuff that people don't consider. But as you said, it's not a balanced assessment as it's laid out within the book. In terms of your objections to the procreative asymmetry, as you said, it's like the procreative asymmetry, the asymmetry between pleasures and pains, as David Benatar kind of lays it out. It's presented as a justification for these other kind of views or other intuitions that we hold.
Explanation,
What do you think are some of those intuitions that do hold that the procreative asymmetry is used to? I keep saying the asymmetry as if there's only one. There's obviously many asymmetries.
You say the procreation asymmetry.
Yeah, sorry.
The procreation asymmetry refers to the view that while it is wrong to bring people who will only suffer into the world, it is not wrong to not create people who would be happy if they existed. I don't think that's hard to understand. I think that's because we have obligations only to actual future people who will exist. And if somebody's not exist, there's no subject to the harm, there's nothing to talk about, there's no problem. I actually wrote a paper on this called Existence, Who Needs It? So that addresses that kind of question. Benatar's asymmetry is an asymmetry between the value of between absent pleasures and absent pains.
Yes.
Right. And I think I think the four views, and I can't remember each one of them, but that he thinks this best explains. I think those are all explained by what I just said, that you need a subject to suffer or to enjoy things. And if you don't have an interested subject, we have nothing to discuss. And so that explains the procreation asymmetry. I think it also explains Benatar's asymmetry between the experience of pleasure and the experience of pain. So I think that argument of his is actually quite weak.
Yes.
And I don't have a sympathy for that. I don't think it succeeds.
And in terms of other views on procreative ethics or other kind of reasons that people get to the antinatalist conclusion in terms of the misanthropic arguments, or an opportunity cost of having children, so donating money instead.
So let's talk about those two things.
Yes, what are your views on those?
Okay, so the misanthropic argument, if I get this correctly, is that people are terrible and therefore we shouldn't exist, and we also ruin things for the animals and the other creatures in the world. I am not sympathetic to this argument. I think most people are not at all terrible. Look around. Think about all the people you went to school with. I mean, they're not great, but they're not terrible. Doing horrible things. I think most people, and especially if you think about creating a new person, if you have a child and you don't abuse the child, the chance that they're going to grow up into some kind of psychopathic, criminal, terrible person is extremely low. Quite low, right? The worst people in the world most of the time were raised with a lot of cruelty. So if you're going to raise your child with a lot of cruelty, don't have a child. Easy. But if you're not going to raise your child in a cruel way, you can make a lot of parenting mistakes, which we all make, and your kid will still not be terrible. So bad that it shouldn't exist. Okay. So what about the animals? I think there are things we can do to share the planet with other kinds of life forms aside from going extinct. So I think that is an extreme solution that is not necessary. I also think, perhaps other people will disagree on this point, that if, let's say, the continued existence of humanity will mean that a certain species of bird will go extinct, I don't think I have to go extinct instead of the bird. Why do I have to pick the bird over me? Why can't I pick me? So I am unpersuaded by the misanthropic arguments. I find them completely unpersuasive. I think there are other things we can do to share the world with animals. And I think that if it's us or the animals, we're entitled to pick ourselves. I don't know why we have to pick them. And I don't think people are so terrible as to make creating a person a crime. In fact, it kind of goes the other way, because so now the good people won't have children. The awful people will continue to have children. And then you'll have much more misanthropy because you'll only have bad people. So I am not persuaded by that at all.
And I do think, interestingly, that when I come across people who are like having ethical reasons for not having children, that kind of environmental misanthropy, the idea that nature is just beautiful and it's all in harmony, is like humans are ruining it, that seems to be quite pervasive in society, you know.
I don't know why,
for want of a better word, normies.
Yeah, I don't know why people think this. It's completely weird to me. I also think, like, yeah, you don't want to have a mass extinction, but it's not like every species, oh, this is going extinct, that's going extinct. That's how the world works. Things go extinct. You're not going to stop it by also going extinct.
Yes. And it does seem as well, when I have seen humans argue, you know, people argue for human extinction because humans are causing mass extinctions, without first establishing the harm of extinction. You know, if a walrus doesn't come into existence tomorrow, I don't see that as a massive harm for that individual walrus. And as a non-speciesist, I really struggle to see the kind of value of species. In this corner of the antinatalist community, like the wild animal suffering kind of corner of the antinatalist community, we definitely agree that the very rosy view of nature that humans are trashing, those kind of arguments don't particularly hold up.
Yeah, it's not like without people, life was so great for the predator who's hungry, or the prey who's always running away.
Yes. And I think that if you're really concerned about suffering, like humans, I know that, you know, and sometimes I've come across as maybe a bit uncaring on this point, but I know that paying taxes and getting up and doing a job that you don't want to do, that can suck. But I mean, I would take that to being, as you said, like running away from a predator, which is far more sentient beings have to go through than the pains that humans typically face.
And if you're going to your job and paying taxes, get up in the morning, have a cup of coffee, come home at night, have a drink, we'll go pretty good. So I don't think that's grand suffering. Plus, you know, you can often try to have a job you like and have things that are fulfilling. So there's other ways to have meaning in your life, even if your job is not. But you also asked about the personal opportunity cost of having children. Yes.
I just wanted, before we get to that one, sorry, I did have one point on the misanthropic argument. And again, I think with misanthropy, a lot of it is tied into like viewing humans in a very bad way. I think, again, a lot of it tied to environmentalism. I do think that the misanthropic arguments hold up as they relate to like an intuition I have about animal agriculture, and like the moral value of non-human animals. And that's that I don't know how much to value non-human animals. I kind of assume that humans can suffer and experience pleasure to a much greater extent than non-human animals can. So seeing as that's what I care about, I value humans to a much greater extent. But it does seem to me that, seeing as, at least in the West, where, you know, we can eat a lot of meat and a lot of fish and chicken and a lot of smaller animals who do seem to live quite bad lives. Even if I valued moral animals to like 1/1000th the extent to of a human, but I knew there was a good chance that my kid would consume thousands of animals over the course of their life. Like, would I be justified in creating a kid if I knew that they would do, let's say, again, this is terrible utilitarian math, and I know it's probably not going to land particularly well, but would I be justified in terms of like creating a kid that would do as much harm as, like, you know, a serial killer that killed 2 or 3 humans?
So
through like the harm that they would do to other sentient beings.
Well, I'm not going to say like a human life is worth this number of animal lives. I don't think math or value works this way at all. But I will say, if you think that eating, let's say factory farming, I think is inexcusable. And so I wouldn't say the same thing about eating animals. I think a lot of people need to eat animals. So that's, or when we're hungry or otherwise have allergies, like you can't just, it would be a high cost to give up eating all animals. And I don't think it's so terrible to eat an animal that like lived its animal life and now you kill it and eat it, because I don't think dying is so terrible, and certainly not for most animals. I think being raised the way animals are raised is torture and unacceptable and wrong. Put a period at the end of the sentence. Okay, so let's say you think this. So raise your child not to do it. It's not a requirement. You don't have to.
Mm. And if you did have this intuition, as I do, that it's the equivalent of killing several people, like if I knew that I could raise my kid in a society where however many percent, like 99% of people were going to be serial killers, and I was like, but my kid won't be because I'm going to raise them right, and then they go to school where all their friends are participating, would that be an irresponsible thing to do, do you think, in terms of like...
I mean, I think usually most people are fairly consistent with their parents' values. So I don't think that great a risk. And I also think, again, the better solution is to work against factory farming instead of deciding not to have children. You don't have children. If you're thinking about it in the way you're thinking about it, you don't have children. Well, all the people who eat meat, they're having plenty of children.
Yes.
And they'll eat even more meat and be even crueler to the chickens and the cows and the pigs that suffer so much, which is terrible. So I'm not persuaded as a reason not to have children. I'm persuaded that is a reason not to participate in factory farming. I also think, maybe in contrast to you, that there are ways of eating animals that are kind of acceptable. They're humanely raised and they get to, which doesn't really happen that much anyway. I mean, you know what? I think a free range chicken gets a square foot of space.
Yes, it's pretty low in the UK. Yeah. I think it's the same in America as well. Yeah.
Free roaming chicken gets, can maybe walk up a hill.
Yes.
But free range is a square foot. It's nothing. That didn't used to be the case, and it doesn't have to continue to be the case. So but I don't see that as sort of, well, because this crime is happening now. Let's say during the time, let's say slavery is popular in your society. Should you not have a child because so many people own slaves? I don't think that follows. I think you should raise your child and teach them how bad it is to have a slave and work against slavery. That is what I think a more appropriate response is, instead of just saying, well, we're done with humanity because we did this bad thing.
I think less so than being done with humanity, but I do wonder in that, as you've said, that the child necessarily wouldn't have been missing out on anything if you hadn't created them, with this big risk that they would. And in this example, they would have to be causing more people to be enslaved than if you hadn't brought them into existence in this case.
You never have a child for the sake of the child, in my opinion. You have a child because you want a child.
I agree on that.
It's for you. It's selfish. You're doing it for you. Hopefully it's consistent with the good of the child, or not bad for the child, or a permissible risk to impose for the sake of it. So you're not doing it for the child. You want to have a child. I don't think you have to stop yourself because there's a bad practice going on in society. I think the bad practice is something you should work against. You should teach your child to work against, and that is a more appropriate and probably more effective response than to just not have a child, where then they'll be working against this bad practice and it will continue to flourish unchecked.
And I think that does link nicely onto the next objection, or next reason for being an antinatalist, or at least for not having children, that I raised, which was the opportunity cost, the idea that maybe I could raise my kid right and they'll be a good person, that kind of thing. Or I could try and donate money to, let's say, the non-factory farming or the anti-factory farming charity, that kind of thing. What are your thoughts in terms of how that relates to like procreative ethics?
Well, I'm not a consequentialist. I don't think you're obligated to save the world, fix the world, help the world, none of these things. I don't know why you're born a slave to the state of the universe. I just don't see this as an argument. I don't think you have to do I think raising another good person in the world is a very productive thing. But let's take your do-gooding, put on the do-gooder's hat.
That's what we love to do here at Antinatalist Advocacy.
Right. I think that when you raise, maybe the calculus, I'm not doing the math of it because I don't believe in that. But when you raise a good person, a productive person, that is a tremendous contribution to the world. Someone has to take care of people. Somebody has to vote for the right people. Somebody has to be a positive influence in the world. And if you are creating a child and raising them in a loving way with good values, you're doing a great thing for the world. Much more than your $300 is going to some aid agency that bungles the aid half the time, uses it in the wrong way. There's a lot of problems with trying to fix everything too, which I know we're going to get to later. But even setting those problems aside, I don't think you are required, first of all, and this is connected to that, to sacrifice yourself for everybody else. I don't know why that should be required of you. And I also think that the way you're thinking about it minimizes how much good you are doing by raising a productive, positive person in the world. If all the good people don't have children, who's going to have children? All the bad people. Then you're going to need so much more money to fix everything. You can never raise that kind of money.
That's true. I guess I wonder, there's something that we've talked about on the podcast before about delayed philanthropy, which is definitely something that I notice as an objection to people who don't have children for ethical reasons. The idea that my kid, and for some reason, this is the stock line that everyone goes to, my kid could be the one that cured cancer. And I'm always tempted to ask people, I don't know, you definitely didn't say that. Yours were like much more kind of modest and realistic in terms of like voting patterns and this kind of thing. Because I think that people do, but I think it does get to something, even with the wildly optimistic expectations or hopes that people might have for their children. The idea that their kids can be the one to do good. And I do wonder the extent to which that has maybe a bit of a lack of personal responsibility in terms of like people not taking responsibility to try and do good in their own lives. I guess.
But you are doing it in your life because you are because every society needs a next generation of productive citizens. Look at where populations are crashing. It's going to cause a lot of suffering. Who's going to do the work? Who's going to help the old people? Right. So you don't have to be a hero to be a worthwhile person. You don't have to be exception to be acceptable. You just have to be reasonably good kind of a person, which I think most people who are not raised in cruel ways are. And then you're contributing to society. So you don't have to cure cancer. You can be a nurse. You can be a grocery store because people need groceries. You're still doing in the world. And when you raise somebody in that way, that is a big contribution to the world, perhaps even more effective than the money you would otherwise give away, which I don't see so many people otherwise giving away anyway.
Yes, and I do definitely think that, and I think, again, this is something that you hear when people bring up the humans are trashing the environment kind of arguments. So yes, birth rates are actually plummeting and causing massive societal problems. And I think that, although I am reminded of Benatar's phrase about the procreative Ponzi scheme, the idea that we keep bringing in, if there's, we keep bringing in the next generation to make our lives go well, and then so on and so on and so forth. I do worry that, bringing in the next generation to fix our problems, that feels a bit I feel very uncomfortable about that.
That's the only reason you're creating them. Then you're using them as a mere means to solve your problems, and it's impermissible. But if you're creating them because you want to lovingly raise them and have this symbiotic relationship with them, where that you both benefit from the love and the intimacy that you have together, and then I don't see it that way. You're not just creating people to like mow the lawn. That would be wrong, right? Your child is not doing something just for you, or even to have a child just because you want somebody to take care of you in old age. That's a mere means, like a slave. That's unacceptable. But if because I do restrict procreation to the motive to lovingly raise and nurture a child. You have to really want to be the parent in a loving and nurturing and good way. Yes. And that's what we want it for this special kind of unique relationship, which is special and unique and beautiful. And then it can be acceptable if it is also good for the child, right? It's also the child benefits and you don't own them. They run their own life. They decide what to do with it. But when you raise them in a loving way, they will most likely decide to do good things and be good in the world.
Yes. And there is something that you just said there that I think, again, another point to bear in mind for antinatalist advocates is that there is a big opportunity cost by not having children. Now, again, there's a lot of people who don't particularly like kids, or at least don't like kids at this point in their lives, that end up at the antinatalist conclusion, which always makes me a bit nervous because I'm thinking, like, okay, what 17-year-old is thinking? Like, okay, you don't want to have kids now. Are you still going to feel the same way at 32? Like, I don't feel the same way as I do about life at 17. But I do think there is something that's being seriously kind of like giving up. And, like involuntary childless, it can cause a lot of suffering in people's lives. And I do worry that antinatalists don't necessarily take that seriously when they're out there preaching a good antinatalist message.
Yeah, I think, look, if you don't want to have children, it's easy. Don't have children. I always say that's the more morally conservative choice. Terrific. But I don't think people should minimize what you're giving up. It is a spiritual experience for people. It's an emotional experience. It's a very special kind of relationship. It is extremely enduring. The bond is close. It changes your whole perspective on things. It binds you to the world so that you sort of care more about it. It makes life much more meaningful. Everything matters more. You also worry yourself to death if you're like me. So that adds another element. I think if I didn't have kids, I'd be like, well, fine, let the world go open. That's fine with me. And I wouldn't have to worry about what happens to me. I could die tomorrow. It's fine. But it is, there's of course, there's the biological reason people have children, but you are an animal. That's part of it. It's just, it gives life a certain kind of richness and a fullness. And doesn't mean that you can always do it, but I would say but it's a lot to give up.
Yes.
So you have to justify that cost.
Definitely. And I do think, which will lead on to our next topic around effective altruism, I have to some extent replaced my, hoping to replace some of that meaning in my life by putting on my do-gooder hat. So before we get to tearing down my my meaning for existing in this world, so I can send off my little direct debit at the end of the month to charity. What are your overall views on like effective altruism and mostly as a philosophy rather than the broader community, which is how we tend to talk about effective altruism and antinatalist advocacy, more in terms of like the very kind of like top level ideas around doing good and trying to follow like an impact kind of focus.
I want to take a step back for a second because I realize I don't know that I've expressed my own view about procreative permissibility. Which is
yes, we've kind of run through the other arguments rather than getting to your own view.
So my argument is I think of creating a person as one of the instances of imposing a risk. We have sort of frameworks for that, for what kinds of risks are permissible to impose. We look at the benefits and the burdens of imposing the risk on the risk imposer and the risk imposee, which would be the future child, the cost to the child, the cost to you of not imposing the risk. And then we decide whether the risk is permissible. And so in this case, we have to look at what would be the cost to the person of not creating a child and what are the potential risks to the child. And then we have to come up with some kind of principle that adjudicates those interests. And my principle was, well, you can only have a child if it would be rational for you to accept. You would have to say, well, it would be rational if let's say I was, for me to accept those burdens in exchange for this benefit of having children. So that's the way the procreative, I think, balance principle works. And then I also say there's a motivation restriction. You have to be motivated, at least in part, by the desire to raise, nurture, and love a child, because otherwise I think you have no excuse. You don't need to impose the risk, and that's the end of it. So that is the way in which that's the proper framework that I think applies, because it's the kind of act that procreation is, and it gives us a more complex kind of answer in different cases, but it does rule out a lot of procreation, actually.
Yes. So that's what I was going to ask. That does seem to limit the potential window of justifiable procreation.
Yes, it limits it a lot, and it get the win and the justification gets radically less with each child, because your first child makes you a parent, and then you have this role, the thing you want, and so the permissibility drops very, very much for any subsequent child. to the point where it's probably never permissible to have 4 children or maybe even 3 children. Or I don't know, 2 children. That siblings, I think, are good for people and good for a family structure. But even that may not be outweighed by the risks. And so there are many kinds of ways in which I think procreation is impermissible, especially if you already have one child. Have children when you're older or when you have genetic diseases in common, I think is most of the time not okay.
Yes. And I do think that your arguments really do, they really do get into the really interesting points around, as you're saying, like when to have children and how many children to have, and the point around like the diminishing returns of having children. I'm from a family of 4, which I know is a lot fewer siblings than you have. The 3.
That is correct. I have 10 siblings.
But the idea being that, okay, like you're a parent now, you've kind of like, you've ticked that box off, you've got that meaning in your life. Do you need a 3rd, a 4th, a 5th, a 6th child?
Yeah. So those, but again, it begins with the framework of what kind of an act is it? Yes. And then, well, let's look at how we determine the permissibility of risk imposition. And we can use that to decide about the permissibility of this particular risk imposing act. Yes.
And I do think that your framework, it starts from the the honest reason that why people have children, which is that they want to have meaning in their lives. And it's a big sacrifice if they don't. And I think that a lot of people, when they argue against antinatalism, they come from, well, if they're not just calling us depressed, like terminally online losers or something like that, it's often comes from the idea of, I'm doing a great service, or I want to do good in the world, or even I'm doing this wonderful thing for my child. And at the same time, I do think that antinatalists can be not particularly charitable to reasons that people do want to have children. Like we talked before about how antinatalists can kind of like diminish the huge sacrifice that not having children can be for some people. So I really do think that your framework, it starts from the ground up in terms of like, people have this desire, and now we're trying to figure out where that might be permissible in this narrow.
I do like to do things from the ground up. And the paper that we had discussed that you're going to link to, the It Ain't My World paper, that is my criticism of very demanding moral theories, that they don't start from the ground up. They start from the middle. And if they started from the ground up, I don't think they could get going.
So let's dive in then with your views on effective altruism, and particularly, as I was saying before, like particularly as a philosophy, and most of your points of disagreement, or at least parts that you've published about, they're on that kind of moral obligation, or like the very high demand that certain philosophers and certain ideas can put upon individuals to be a do-gooder and to like make large sacrifices to try and do good in the world. So it'd be great if you can give us an overview of your views on EA and like your points of agreement and disagreement.
So most of my points are disagreement. I do not think the person is obligated. I don't know how you're born obligated to fix a mess you did not make, which is this world. I don't understand why that would be the case. And it's kind of interesting to me because it's similar to some, I think antinatalists should be sympathetic to this point of view. The same way you shouldn't be born without your permission, let's say. This is even worse. I'm born a slave to everybody else's problems that I did nothing to create. So I just don't see how you get that obligation started. I think we have obligations to each other based on sort of social contracts or moral status, things we can't do to people, things we should do to people, but not this blanket obligation to just fix this broken world that you didn't break and didn't ask to be in. That's the that is sort of a fundamental basic disagreement. Once you think you are obligated to people or to help people in general, I don't know that this is the best. Well, no, I'm going to say something else. I also think there's something about this idea of effective altruism that almost shows a lack of respect for yourself. You're like pimping yourself out to the world. Oh, where can I do most good? What job should I get? Well, what happened to you? What happened to what you want? What happened to the job you want to do? To the projects you want to have in the world? It's like you're just giving that up. And I don't think that's consistent with self-respect. And I don't know. And I don't think that's a good thing to do. I also think that the world needs all the jobs. So do the one you like. I mean, unless you're going to do a bad thing, right? So don't do the job of serial killer. We don't need that job, right? But all the productive jobs, the world needs all of them. So you can be a teacher, you can be an artist, you can be even people talk about like, oh, stockbrokers. Well, the monetary system creates a lot of wealth and well-being for people. It also does bad things. We can talk about that too. But it's not as if like, the world would be great without money. Without money, we'd be trading potatoes. And nobody would have an iPhone. We like our iPhones. And we probably wouldn't have enough potatoes. So this idea that, so there's just a disrespect of yourself. And I can kind of sympathize with it. I think when you're starting out in life, you want to have a cause because then you don't have to figure out what to do with your life. So it's like, well, let me just, it would be great if it was World War II and I could join the right side and sacrifice my life. And then I wouldn't have to figure out what to do with it, which is, going to be more disappointing than that.
Yes.
And so it's kind of a relief. But I think it's a mistake. I think you should go through the angst of trying to figure out what you would like to do with your life and do that thing. And it will probably contribute to the world in a very nice way. It will not fix the world or save the world. The world doesn't want to be saved. But you will be doing something that is good for you and the world. You'll make a contribution and it will be meaningful to you. So that's a second argument, separate against effective altruism. So we've got a few. First of all, the fundamental one, the responsibility to yourself, the value of yourself. Then there's also the kind of hubris of it. So I think a guy named Lenman wrote a paper called Consequentialism and Cluelessness, where he says, do you know that paper?
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So the idea is like you have no idea how things will ripple out, and you go do, you're saving this baby, and it's baby Hitler. So
yes, that's the classic example of like, but did the nurses do something wrong that treated baby Hitler?
Yeah. So of course there's a good response to that, which is, you play the odds and you always work on probabilities. That's how people live their lives. I think that response works to an extent. So it works to the extent that, yes, you fish the baby out of the pond because it's probably not baby Hitler, and because baby Hitler isn't Hitler yet anyway, but that's a different question. But once you start putting all of your life energies into fixing things, well, then you've put much more of a strain on, then you're on how certain you have to be that what you're going to do is going to be effective, because you're putting all your eggs in that basket. That's all you're doing with your life, is fixing something. And then you have to be more sure that it's going to fix that thing. And I think often we don't know the further effect. And finally, and perhaps the strongest argument, except for the foundational argument against effective altruism, is that it's the most common objection to utilitarianism is that when the ends justify the means, you can do really terrible things in the name of an end that you may not be achieving. Yes. So you couple the cluelessness with the things you're going to do. You throw all the rules out the window. You do whatever you want to fix something or to make something better. And then you will have done all these terrible things, and you may not even made the thing better. And so I think that it is more humble and realistic to say, well, I don't know every effect, so I'm going to have a modest life where I obey moral constraints and try to contribute to my own life, because I should value myself and the world. And I think that is more morally conservative and more morally justified.
Yes, and I do think, especially after the whole Sam Bankman-Fried fiasco, which we'll definitely link to in the articles below, the idea of the ends justify the means kind of thinking within the EA community, I do think that there has been a bit more of a push into being a bit more morally kind of, as you said, a bit more humble.
But Sam Bankman-Fried didn't do such terrible things. He just took people's money. What about somebody like Hitler, the final solution, right?
Yeah,
he was going to solve everything. Communism ends, right? A lot of totalitarian governments promise whenever they promise you utopia, and then they kill you for that end.
Yes.
So that is it's not, Sam Bankman-Fried is the least of your worries, because he didn't have a lot of power. When people are elected into positions of power and work on ends justifies the means kind of promises, they end up doing a lot of terrible things.
Yes.
And the promises don't usually pan out. Now I know they're not effective altruists. Hitler, wasn't an effective altruist, but he took the good game, final solution, rid the world of these, terrible vermin Jews that ruin everything. Very popular idea, including right now. People love it. And it's not just, there's Pol Pot, there's Stalin.
Yeah.
The idea, when people, the more power people have, and the more they say the ends justify the means, the worse things seem to turn out. So that should be a little bit of a cautionary tale, no?
No, definitely. And that is something that we've pointed out, that the history of the 20th century is a reason to be a little cautious of all-encompassing grand solution type ideologies, which unfortunately some people can view antinatalism and the big red button, the kind of version of antinatalism, as in terms of like a grand solution to all of the world's problems. I think it'd be great to dive into the the fundament, the positive obligations objection, and how a lot of the time within effective altruism that the obligations don't kind of start from the ground up. So like with the classic thought experiment that Peter Singer laid out of, you walk past the drowning child in the pond and then you fish the child out, and then therefore you try and look at the moral distinctions between that child and other suffering that occurs, and your obligations to help that suffering, and therefore you have the strong obligation to kind of solve suffering like wherever it occurs. Where do you think are the flaws in that line of thinking, starting from that quite narrow and I don't know if conservative is the right view, but quite humble action of solving the problem that's directly in front of you that you have the power to solve, and how that kind of like cascades, if you like, to these other moral obligations?
Because you would have to ask why do you have to pull the kid out? The reason you have to pull the kid out is because the cost to you is low. Because if everybody helped the kid in front of them, things would be pretty good. Because you have contractual and societal relationships with the people in your town, with the people in your state, with the people that you pay taxes together with. Because you would be, treating the child as if they don't exist. If you just walk right by them and they're right in front of you, and you could so easily do something like that. And so then that does not translate into having to solve all the world's problem all over the place. Why should distance matter? Because it does. Because the person miles away from you does not have the same relationship to you as the kid in your town or the kid who wandered onto your street. And it depends on, and you're not denying the humanity of people worlds away if you don't give them half of your lunch. They're not in your, they're not. Now, that doesn't mean that you can ignore suffering all over the world. Say you're not right in front of me, but you have to. But I think a contractualist framework, which shows you, or a Kantian kind of contractualist framework, which shows you why you are more bound to the people you've committed to in your life, to the people you've made promises to your children who you've forced into existence. Your first obligation is to them, to the people in your society for whom you have reciprocal relationships with. You pay taxes together. You use similar resources. Now, you also use resources all over the world, but that relationship is weaker and the obligation is weaker. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It does exist, but it is weaker. And so that is where I think that the kind of the Peter Singer, Peter Unger kind of argument doesn't say why you are obligated to the people at all. And unless you say that, you don't know how the obligation extends.
Yes. And I think that's your points around the social contract and how you're contractually obligated to those you have that relationship with. Definitely on this podcast, people agree that you owe your children a lot because you're the one that created them.
So isn't it odd to say you owe your children so much, but then you also owe some child who's not your fault, you didn't bring them into existence, just as much?
Yes, if you take the kind of like pure consequentialist idea of, and I do think this is where, utilitarians can lose at least a lot of popular appeal when they.
It's not just popular appeal. It's a theoretical flaw in the argument. Even Mill, when Mill writes his utilitarianism book, and he says, well, what's the good? The good for each person is the happiness of each person. Therefore, the good for the aggregate is the happiness of the aggregate. He doesn't explain why I personally should care about that, or why I have to put everybody else's happiness on par with my own, or with my children's, or with my wife's. And so it is a conceptual flaw that goes right to the root of utilitarianism, which has never explained why its obligations obligate you. And one of my colleagues in the Claremont colleges, Paul Hurley, wrote a book called Beyond Consequentialism, which argues this point, where he says utilitarianism does not obligate you. His argument is a little bit different, but it's the same print. It's the same at root, similar, which is, where is the obligation? Where does it come from? And so until you can explain to me where that comes from, I don't know how. And then, of course, when you don't explain where it comes from, and then you take it to the nth degree, you have to give to the point of marginal utility. That's a really bad combo, argument-wise, because you don't have the foundation of it, and then its obligations are extreme, which of course is not a coincidence, but they're two bad mistakes.
Yes, and I think they are separate, and you don't necessarily have to buy one to buy the other. It's like who you have the obligations to, and then the extent of your obligations to those who you have the obligation to.
Yes. But
and do you think that? Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, do you think that, like, I think, you know, with the classic pulling the child out of the pond, you can't literally physically pull the child out of the pond, that lives the other side of the world to you. But do you think, therefore, in a world where we can potentially, and again, you might object to quite a bit of this, but we could potentially, our money could go further to do more good, if you like, by sending it to the other side of the world electronically, rather than those within your own society, particularly in a Western society where we do have quite a lot invested within us, at least within our own society, and we have social safety net and all this kind of thing. Do you agree that it could at least be better, or at least a better thing for the person to do, if they were looking at it from a purely impact sense, if not a morally obligatory thing for that person to do, to take this approach?
A purely impact sense is an empirical question, and I don't really know the answer because I don't know how effective our altruism is. I do think we have obligations to everyone in the world, but they're weaker to some people than to others. So I don't think we can sit in a wealthy country and let's say see a famine somewhere and be like, well, okay, go ahead and starve. But actually, we don't do that. And most famine is because somebody wants someone else to starve. So not because there's not enough food, because there's tons of food. So that would be my answer. We do have obligations to people far away, but they're not as strong as to the people close to us. So we have to balance that out.
And I do think this touches on the next point, which would be distinguishing the two between who you have the obligation to and the extent of your obligations. Seeing as effective altruism appears to be, at least the way that I see it practiced, it's the obligations, well, again, like, actually, depends who you're talking to. But I do see that, like, a lot of effective altruists having an obligation, or like believing that they have these obligations, as you do, to people around the world, and they're coming to the conclusion that their money could go further if they pick causes which are less popular in the West for numerous reasons. You know, we all know people who die of cancer. It's quite rare to know someone in the UK who dies of malaria, for example. It's a cause that's like resonates with us less. So they therefore pick a cause where they think that their money can go further, and they also donate, say, like 10%, like the classic kind of religious tithe in Judaism or Christianity. They give 10% of their money rather than like giving to marginal utility. You know, they still buy their grandma a Christmas card. You know, they might take a holiday occasionally, but they are giving what would be considered in many circles like a considerable chunk, but not a life-changing chunk. Do you think, therefore, that effective altruism, in terms of the way that it's practiced, it's not saying that, or at least the people aren't saying that we have, you know, the obligation here is just as strong as it would be to my own mother. I just think that this is, I can probably have more scope to help this person. And the actual the scope of the obligation is quite modest. Do you think that is, at least as it's practiced, is quite a positive thing, or at least can be seen as quite a positive thing?
I do think it can be. And that's why I kind of like, you know, tithing would be a great thing if people did it. Because think about the people who have a lot of money, who 10% is a lot. They don't
Yes.
give 10%. That would be great. I think it's and 10%, you can live with giving away 10%. It's a modest ask, and it could go really far. And I think that effective altruism would be more effective if it was more modest in its demands, because the demands would then have a better foundation for making them. Right? Because because I do think we are obligated to all people in the world to different degrees. But if we all gave away some of our extra money, not all of it, right? Because I don't think you have to give away all of it again, because I think I think you're a person too, and you can live your own life and you don't have to save the world. But, you could give 10%, we can do it. I think that is much more practical and also more conceptually sound.
Yes. And I do think I think I would agree on those 2 points, at least on the practical point. And we had this funny exchange in our last podcast episode where we're having people criticize how we present antinatalist advocacy, and we just chose the EA tagline of doing the most good. And then it was really something around doing good, but maybe more good than if you hadn't thought about it and tried to kind of impact focus and given a bit more money than you otherwise would have done, or something like that. And that just doesn't really kind of hit home in the way that but I do think it is more conceptually honest. It is, and it does better describe what at least effective altruism, the way that it's practiced, it gets at, helping people to do more good than they maybe otherwise would have done. But yes, I do agree that philosophically, and certainly in terms of the things that make the headlines and the kind of conversations that go on in the EA spaces, I do think that they are.
I also think that they neglect your local good. So fine, it's great. Buy some malaria nets. But maybe you should do some grocery shopping for your neighbor who can't get to the store. Maybe you should volunteer with kids in your neighborhood. There's a lot of local good that people can do that is more time consuming, more annoying, and does a lot of good. It's easier to give your money away. And again, the same way that I said the world needs all the jobs, the world needs all the good. So you don't have to force, some people who don't give a lot of money, they're doing other good things. So it's a narrowness to say, like, this is the only way to be good. You got to, give all your, pick a job that makes you money and give all of it away. So if you sacrifice your own life and you're only doing one kind of good, there are lots of kinds of goods. Yes. I do wonder that the way that you were describing the good, because this is actually a really popular way of viewing good in the animal activist community. The guys who go out to the factory farms and they record what's going on there and they get beaten up by the farm workers and arrested, this kind of thing. They're seen as like the green berets of animal activists, and the boring, nerdy, effective altruist type who donates to a factory farming charity, they're seen as like the kind of soft, cushy ones. And I think there is some merit to that. But from an impact perspective, I'm not sure this kind of like personal sacrifice approach to doing good, in terms of like being more of an inconvenience, that feels to me a bit like the person who's longing for World War II so that they can give their life to something. And so maybe I wasn't clear in what I was saying. I don't mean you should do something because it hurts you more and because it's more of a sacrifice. I am saying sometimes it is easier to give money and less, and it's not less effective, or also just only one way of doing good. Yes. Why exclude all the other ways of doing good? No, I think people who run, the protesters and the activists, I'm not sure how much good they do or don't do. But again, if they do good, it's one kind of good. In other words, why narrow your world into only one way of being and one kind of way of doing good? That's what I meant by that. Yes. And also not to neglect the local good that's really important. Yeah. So sometimes I can imagine an effective altruist world where everyone is like, gave everything away to the point of marginal utility, and everybody has food, but none of the food's very good. And everybody can live, but who wants to live? There's no symphony. There's no good coffee. Yes. There's no, I don't know, whatever else makes you really know. There's no good philosophy. So I don't want to be there. Yes. And I do think that is something, again. Good is varied. And the
Yes.
way you do good is varied. And so again, keeping those things in mind, when you say the end justifies the means, you run into a lot of these other kinds of problems of what you're giving up and how you're giving it up. And I just think it's a dangerous way of thinking. So the same, do the job you like, do the kind of good you like, because we need all of it. It's fine. Don't do the kind of good that violates people's rights don't do that kind of good. Don't do ends justifies the means goods. But otherwise, there's a million ways to do good and to be a good person. And so you don't have to narrow yourself to one way. I think that's, it's not correct.
Yes, and I do think one of the things that you brought up before is around like local goods, which are typically overlooked within EA spaces because a lot of EAs are from the first world, and they say, well, therefore, like local charity and this kind of thing is maybe overrated, and we should look to other kind of niche causes. And I'm interested, like, what do you think that those positive obligations are in terms of like local good and how they should factor into our approach if we want to put our do good at hat on?
Okay, so I think I am a Kantian in terms of, or Aristotelian maybe a little bit, in terms of doing good. So I think that you need to help some people in some ways, some of the time, and then you fill in how. That's just the Kantian obligation. In order to show that you respect people as ends in themselves, and that you're following rules that you could rationally universalize, it can't be the case that you never help anybody. You have to be a helpful person. You have to develop your talents. And I leave a lot of permission space, and that's, I think, correct. And that is, again, another advantage of the Kantian approach. It's more consistent with human nature. It's more consistent with, I think, having a good life for yourself and also for creating a good life with other people.
And that was just going to say, one thing I've really liked from your work, and I've mentioned it a few times, is that I do think that you ground a lot of your arguments in human nature and try and base it in terms of like how people actually respond to philosophical arguments, which again may be missing sometimes in the antinatalist communities. Kind of, to some extent, maybe ignores I don't know if ignoring the humanity is the right sense, but as you said, that point around maybe pimping yourself out or just reducing yourself to
just a
well-being factory. Yes.
Why live at all?
Not even a well-being factory, like a worker bee or like an ant in a colony with no agency.
Well, it's similar to Williams's objection to utilitarianism, where he says it turns you into a cog in the utilitarian calculus.
Yes. And I do think this is something that a lot of utilitarians and people aligned with EA have struggled, not necessarily even struggled with, but puts people off. I think a great criticism of Derek Puffett was that he kind of viewed people as like vessels for well-being in a way, and that the well-being is what mattered, and if it somehow mattered outside of the person, and he was kind of churning people into this machine, and then, like the well-being ticker would move up and down in some sort of objectives.
Some of his problems are conceptual, like the non-identity problem, which I think is a mistake, a metaphysical mistake. But I think his other problems are because of his consequentialism, even though he didn't admit that he was one. And he thought he put all the theories together, and have his, the one unifying theory, his own book. But I think that in that book, he doesn't understand Kantian ethics. I don't think he does, because he talks about it in terms of like, well, what you would always agree to what maximizes your own good. That's not even true. Sometimes, you wouldn't accept something that would help you because of the way it's given, or because of the insult, or because of the way. Because he forgets relations between people. With him, it's either personal or impersonal. Forgetting that a lot of ethics, maybe all ethics, is interpersonal. I wouldn't say all, but there's certainly, because I think that there's personal too. But there's personal and interpersonal.
No, definitely. I think that is missing.
Yeah. And I think maybe now I wouldn't say that effective altruists miss that piece, because you could work it in, but I think they neglect that piece. They neglect the personal, their own development, their own fulfillment, and the interpersonal, relationships with other people, relationships with people in your family, in your friends, in your community, that kind of life, the daily life you live, giving it all up for this abstract, impersonal good.
Definitely. And I think that there has been a bit of soul-searching from what I can see online after the whole Sam Bankman-Fried thing. And I think one of the great articles I saw was like, don't make effective altruism your entire well-being. If all of your friends, your colleagues, your whole life is wrapped up into this one thing, and it can be, this very impersonal kind of approach, that's not much for life. For one thing, it will just put people off getting involved if they see people who are missing a lot of the stuff.
But that's a consequentialist reason.
That's true. Yes. Sorry, this consequentialism is ingrained, unfortunately. Yes. Too much time in internet forums.
My reasons are different. They are for the person themselves to have try to have a full life and achieve their human potential, and for moral reasons to have a good life and a life connected to with relationships. And then the other part, the cautionary tale part, which Sam Bankman-Fried, like I said, is the least of your problems, because all he did was lose money. But ends justifying the means you can do anything. Nothing is off the table. And I think that that is it's immoral, and also often leads to bad consequences too.
Definitely. It's been a really great conversation. Was there anything you wanted to say on the subject of antinatalism and or effective altruism?
I think I've said a lot. I want to sort of have a disclaimer. We just had this free-flowing conversation.
Yes.
It's possible that I said things that I wouldn't say if I was writing a paper or something. So I always want somebody to read my work rather than listen to what I say. But no, I really enjoyed this conversation, actually. So thank you.
Thank you. And I do have a habit of writing out like a long list of bullet points to cover and then just throwing it out the window and just kind of going where my mind takes me. So hopefully it hasn't been too kind of rambly and
it's been great. Thank you.
Strange tangents. Is there anything that you're working on that you would like to signpost people to?
I am working on a book about death, time, and meaning, all kinds of meaning. So ultimate meaning, the point of your whole life. Everyday meaning, the meaning you have in your everyday life. Cosmic meaning, the meaning based on your cosmic role or niche. Death and meaning, and then time and meaning. So it's a lot. I'm not sure what it's going to be called, unfortunately, although it's probably coming out next year. The working title is The Meaning of It All, but I'm also thinking about something like A Somewhat Glorious Disappointment. That might be the title instead. So we'll see. Probably one of those two, but it's a book about death, time, and meaning, and it's going to be published with Oxford, and the manuscript is due in March and should be probably done before then. So sometime next year around this time, hopefully the book will be out. And then after that, I'll be writing about I will be criticizing the human-pet relationship. That's my next. I think it is undignified for the human and the pet.
Yes, there's something that we didn't get into today, even though we did talk about obviously non-humans a while. I mostly, and again, maybe as a vegan, this is quite a rare point, but I do mostly agree on a lot of your comments on pet ownership. And yeah, the very strange interactions that we have with dogs in particular in the UK. The kind of love, or not even love that we have for dogs, but the idea of dogs I find very peculiar. When you were saying about like the meaning of it all as a potential title for your book, I hope this doesn't put you off the title, but that did make me think of Derek Parfit's On What Matters.
Oh God, that does put me off.
Hopefully I'm the only one to form that association. It's because we mentioned him a few times.
I haven't heard anybody say that. The reason I like the meaning of it all is because it's descriptive. It says what the book is about.
Yeah.
But it doesn't, it's not fun. Somewhat Disappointment also says what the book is about, but it has a more fun ring to it. So we'll see.
Yes, I would agree. For me, that sounds more fun for sure.
Well, I am glad to hear that. Because then it needs a subtitle, meaning, death, and time, but to tell you what it's about. But I am now leaning toward A Somewhat Glorious.
Great.
And thanks for that. I will take that to the editors to make them allow.
And speaking of having fun, we always try and end these podcasts, conversations about antinatalism, the meaning of life, doing good, etc. They can be quite depressing from time to time. So we do try and always end on a positive note. So is there anything related to the topics that we've been talking about today that would be a positive note to end on?
You are asking the wrong person. I will give you a joke instead of a positive note.
Great.
So it's a Jewish joke. Two Jews meet on the street. One says to the other, "How are you?" The other guy says, "You want the long answer or the short answer?" He says, "Give me the short answer." The guy says, "Fine." So the first guy says, "And what's the long answer?" He says, "Not fine."
Brilliant.
That's the joke. That's as positive as I can get.
I mean, I think that's pretty good. I think we haven't had many jokes, and I think there could be more jokes, to be honest, in the antinatalist community. It can be quite a humorless place.
Well, that really is telling, though. Yeah. Try to make some more jokes.
Maybe. But then, talking about the dispositional points earlier, if we told more jokes, people might go out and have a lot more kids. So being a consequentialist, maybe we should keep the jokes. Might cheer people up, and then they might have kids to enjoy their brilliant jokes, their brilliant dad jokes.
Yeah. I don't think that's true. I think jokes come from unhappy people. So I don't think that's a worry. I think you're safe with the jokes.
Right. Well, again, thanks so much, Rivka. Really enjoyed having you on. And we'll point people to your work. Will I?
Thank you very much.
Right. And thank you to you, the listener, for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Antinatalist Advocacy Podcast. If you like what you heard today, please subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. We'd also be really grateful if you could help us get the word out there by sharing this episode far and wide, as well as giving us a positive rating on whichever platform you're listening to us on. To find out more about AA, including careers advice, donation recommendations, and different ways to have a positive impact, you can go to our website at antinatalistadvocacy.org. To keep up to date with what we're up to, feel free to subscribe to our monthly newsletter and follow us on your favourite social media platforms. Links to all of the above are in the description. As always, we are hoping you will join us in our antinatalist advocacy.